Tomorrow marks the 76th anniversary of the establishment of the modern state of Israel, when future Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion formally declared the independence of Israel as a nation at midnight on May the 14th. 11 minutes later, the United States, under President Harry S. Truman, became the first nation to recognize the modern state of Israel. Well, 76 years later, Israel faces its greatest threat since its rebirth as a nation, facing not only hostile enemies in the Middle East, but a rising tide of worldwide anti-Semitism. The American left continues to push for the U.S. to withdraw support from Israel, achieving some successes, as we've seen even this last week with the Biden administration's decision to withhold weapons from our major ally, which I believe makes the world a more volatile place. Well, as Christians, how should we view the modern state of Israel from a biblical perspective? And what obligations to Israel has God given us? Well, joining me now to discuss this, Dr. A.J. Nolte, chair of the Government Graduate Program and director of the International Development MA program at Regent University, is also now the director of the newly launched Institute for Israel Studies at Regent University and a member of the Virginia Israel Advisory Board. Dr. Nolte, welcome back to Washington Watch. Always great to have you in the program.
Tony, it's great to be back, and particularly glad to be back as we're getting ready to celebrate such a historic occasion tomorrow.
It really is. Today, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later. Today's Memorial Day in Israel, followed right after that by a celebration of their independence. You know, when discussing Israel, we see around the globe, and including here in the United States, a rising tide of anti-Semitism. But layered into the anti-Semitism is the left's applying a Marxist oppressor versus oppressed lens to Israel and Palestine. How do you view the left's response to Israel's battling? I mean, they're literally battling for their existence. What do you make of this?
I think what we so often see with the left, unfortunately, one of the reasons why, Tony, I would say you and I are probably conservative, is that those who refuse to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And unfortunately, the left is not really learning from the history on Israel and on Palestine. And they're not even looking at the history of where their own views come from. One of the things that I'm going to hopefully be looking into with the new Institute for Israel Studies and working on some events on is actually the roots of this left-wing anti-Semitism go back to the Soviet Union, which, because it was concerned about Zionism taking the allegiance of its own Jewish population away from communism, started an anti-Zionist science. That's what they called it, the science of anti-Zionism. This was manufactured in the Soviet Union. It was broadcasted through their networks of fellow travelers globally. It has profoundly influenced the left, partially catalyzed by Israel's success in the Six-Day War of 1967. So there's a Soviet anti-Zionism that's external. The internal problem that I'm seeing with the left and where there's this oppressor-oppressed dynamic, I'm reminded of an incident in 1982 where a senator at the time on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was talking about the need to, if Israel went into Lebanon, potentially was threatening to cut off aid. And then Prime Minister Menachem Begin is reported to have said, "I am not a Jew with trembling knees. We will defend ourselves." And so, by the way, the name of that senator, Joe Biden. And so important to keep that history in mind also as we're looking at today. And so one of the problems that I think we've seen with the left is that when Israel is seen as weak, then the left wants to support them. But when Israel has the temerity to actually show resilience and stand up and defend itself, that's unacceptable. And I think there's a broader issue there because Israel doesn't fit the narrative of an oppressed people that frees themselves. And we've talked about this before, actually, previously, I think, but it's worth reiterating. Minorities are to be permanent victims. That's their role in the left's religion, their theology, their eschatology. And the Israelis didn't play by the rules. They freed themselves. They stood up. They founded their own nations. They didn't wait for the left to swoop in and save them. And I think we see that dynamic kind of playing out with the Biden administration's reaction to Israel. When Israel is seen as weak or in need of help, then the left is like, oh, yes, of course, we'll support you. But the minute the Israelis stand up and say, no, we're going to take care of this ourselves, that's unacceptable.
So Israel refuses to play victim. They
Correct.
want to defend themselves. And in fact, Benjamin Netanyahu has restated that over and over as early as last week, as late as last week in the Day of Remembrance, the Holocaust Remembrance, that never again. They're not going to let this happen again. Speaking of history, and we're almost up against a break, but take us back to the 1920s, the mandate for Palestine. The Jewish people were waiting and waiting, and it never happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's important to keep in mind is that promises were made at by Balfour at San Remo. Um, we could argue that the British maybe promised too many different things to too many different people, but those promises were made. You had Jews that moved in legally. It's important, as Chancellor Gordon Robertson emphasizes, legally bought the land in good faith, came in to the land, and were attacked repeatedly. We could talk about the Hebron massacre of, I believe, in 1929. We could talk about any number of incidents that happened in the Mandate period. We could and should, and one of the things I'm hoping to talk about with the Institute is we could talk about the hundreds of thousands of Jewish refugees from the Middle East, natives of the Middle East, dispossessed, taken in by Israel, now fully integrated into the Israeli nation state. So this is a pattern we've seen over and over again.
All right, Dr. Nolte, we're up against a break. We're going to come back, finish this conversation, and how that sets the stage for today. Israel realizes that ultimately it's up to them. They're going to have to defend themselves, and the threat today is greater than ever before. All right, folks, stick with us. We're coming back with more Washington Watch on the other side of the break. Dr. Nolte, thanks for sticking around. So let's take what we were just talking about there. Israel in 1948, waiting for these promises to be fulfilled. They were not. And so they launched, declaring their own nation midnight on the 14th of May. 11 minutes later, the United States did recognize it. I think Truman was sympathetic, felt he played a key role in history to do that. But many were opposed. And it never would have happened had Israel not pulled the trigger and moved forward. Am I right?
No, I absolutely agree with that. And I think not only would it never have happened, but the Israeli part of Zionism and a core element of Zionism as an ideological movement in Israel. And this is as much true. Zionism is very diverse, but one thing that all Zionists would agree on is that Israel was never something that was to be gifted to the state of Israel. It was something that was never to be gifted to the Jewish people by other people. It was something that would be brought about through the efforts of the Jewish people and for those who are more of a religious bent within the Zionist movement, also through the efforts of God.
And by the way, you can't deny that given the overwhelming odds that they overcame, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. You look at the fact that you have refugees that were armed with sort of mismatched weapons fighting against, let's not forget, Arab armies that had both British and German military training, depending on which army you're talking about. It was a serious mismatch. And it leads to one of the most fundamental differences between the false Arab perception of Israel and the reality. Because what ended up happening was basically you had a bunch of refugees who just come through, for the European refugees among them, one of the worst experiences in Jewish history. For the Middle Eastern refugees who had come after, through a similar, experience of being ethnically cleansed from their homelands, they had nowhere else to go. Their backs against the wall, and they fought to survive, and they won. And that has consistently been the reality. There's this misapprehension born out of left-wing post-colonialism that if you simply kill enough Israelis, that they'll go somewhere else, but they've got nowhere else to go. This is the only homeland they have. We're not dealing with settlers. Oftentimes we hear Israel described as settler colonialism. You're talking about resettled refugees. There's a vast difference, and there's nowhere for them to go.
And I actually heard that from their own lips when I was there about a month ago, walking into some of the kibbutz that were attacked and overrun on October the 7th. They said, we came here for security and peace. Where do we go now? And of course, the prime minister and others saying, we have no place else to go. We will fight to defend ourselves. Let me play a clip of Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State, presidential candidate, and shocked at the wisdom that comes from her lips, but it's an acknowledgement. I'm going to play this clip. Play clip number one.
I have had many conversations, as you have had, with a lot of young people over the last many months now. And you're right, they don't know very much at all about the history of the Middle East, or frankly, about history in many areas of the world, including in our own country.
I mean, truer words have not been spoken, but Dr. Nolte, I would also say that there are many in positions of government, of leadership in our current government that don't understand the history of what you just explained, that Israel will not wave a white flag. They will fight because they have no other place to go, and it is who they are.
Well, Tony, I never thought I'd say this, but Joe Biden has done the impossible. He's made me miss Hillary Clinton. Because she's absolutely right there. There's a willful ignorance, I would say, on the part of a lot of people in government, and then there's just a flat out ignorance among younger folks, especially. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of this in Gen Z, and I hate to tell you, one of the reasons that we formed the Israel Institute here at Regent is because even among Gen Z Christians and biblically faithful evangelicals, the Israel education piece about the realities of the modern state of Israel is not getting to them. And so that's one of the primary goals of the Israel Institute. But yes, I agree. There's a willful ignorance on the part of, I would say, many of our leaders in government as well.
Dr. Nolte, as we talk about the Institute, is a part of that to connect the scriptural mandate, if you will, for believers to recognize, connect with the modern state of Israel, seeing that through the lens of biblical prophecy?
So we have an outstanding School of Divinity at Regent that does a really good job of educating on the biblical aspects and the realities of the land. A piece that's been missing generally in Christian education is educating the next generation about the realities of the modern state of Israel. Not only that Israel is God's people, but also that Israel is a force for good in the world. And so from the School of Government, we're focusing on that contemporary side, although we do work very closely with, and I'm excited to partner with our School of Divinity that covers the theological side.
Given what the Biden administration has done in recent weeks with Israel, withholding the weapons from them, munitions, does this not make the world a more volatile place? Because this puts Israel, kind of puts them into a corner where, as we've been discussing, they will defend themselves. And when they do, it could be a much greater attack than what it would have been had the United States stood beside them.
The purpose of the munitions that we are giving to Israel is precision. It allows them to strike more precisely with fewer civilian casualties. They're going to go into Rafah because of what we've talked about. They have nowhere else to go. They have no choice. And so what the effect of this is more civilian casualties and less discrimination,
Right.
because they won't have the capacity to do that.
And probably upsetting that region of the world in an even greater way. Dr. Nolte, we're out of time. Always great to talk with you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.